Looking for a change of scenery? You may want to consider the great state of Vermont.
Yeah, the Green Mountain State has a new law that will pay people to move there and work remotely. How do you like that? Workers can earn up to $10,000 for 2 years. To be eligible, you must be a full-time employee for an out-of-state business, work primarily from home or a co-working space in Vermont, and become a full-time resident on or after January 1st, 2019. But you better hurry, Mike. Funds will be handed out on a first-come, first-served basis. I wish they would do this in, I don't know, Lake Tahoe. It's a great plan, though.
Be sure to catch an all-new Hannity on Monday night. Sean will interview White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders and Mark Levin. That's at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday night, right here on the Fox News Channel.
And that does it for us. We're going to be back here at 4 p.m. Eastern for more news.
And then I'll see you on the Fox Report at 7. The Journal Editorial Report is up next.
See you soon.
Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. House Oversight Committee Chair Trey Gowdy causing a stir this week when he told Fox's Martha McCallum that he believes the FBI acted properly when it used an informant to investigate Trump campaign aides.
It was President Trump himself who said, number one, I didn't collude with Russia, but if anyone connected with my campaign did, I want the FBI to find that out. It looks to me like the FBI was doing what President Trump said, I want you to do. The FBI did exactly what my fellow citizens would want them to do when they got the information they got, and that it has nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Gowdy's remarks, which came after he and other lawmakers met with FBI Director Christopher Wray and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein last week, are seen by many as debunking President Trump's Spygate narrative. But the White House said Wednesday that there is still cause for concern about the FBI's actions leading up to the 2016 election. Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and Deputy Editor Dan Henninger and columnist Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. All right, Kim, what do you make of Gowdy's remarks there, and where are we on this probe right now?
Well, the first thing I'd note is that there's a lot of different points when you're talking about the FBI's mishandling of 2016. And while Mr. Gowdy seems to be saying that he thinks this informant or spy is okay, we haven't heard him renounce other areas like FISA abuse, which we know he's had concerns with. But I think the bigger point here, look, Mr. Gowdy has always been clear. He's a former federal prosecutor. He tends to have a lot of deference for the Department of Justice and FBI. He's saying that he thinks that they acted appropriately and that this informant was used to investigate Russia, not the campaign. The problem with that, though, Paul, is it's belied by their own investigation. The FBI in 2016 opened a counterintelligence probe into the Trump campaign, not into specific individuals, not into Russia, which would have been a CIA job. They did it into the broader campaign, and they said, and we know that for a fact.
Well, Kim, did Gowdy and Nunes, Devin Nunes, the chairman of that committee, did they see all the documents they've been seeking yet, or was this what Gowdy said a reference to the briefing that they got?
If you listen to Mr. Gowdy, he seems to make it very clear that he's making this judgment based on what Rod Rosenstein and Christopher Wray said to him. He talks about how important it is that they are Trump appointees, loyal, good people. He makes a distinction between them and the crew that came before them. I don't think there's any indication in any way that Mr. Nunes or Mr. Gowdy has seen the vast trove of documents that is in fact related to this question of this informant spy.
All right, Bill, the question I would have is if in fact, let's say Gowdy's right. FBI did everything properly. They had more than ample reason to get the informant. Why wouldn't you tell the Trump campaign or the candidate? Did they have an obligation to do that?
Absolutely. It's why I'm not willing to say, let's say they were right. Because there's so many dots to connect and so many, it's very hard to follow this. But the main question we don't know is, we don't know what started it all. Right? Devin Nunes saw the electronic communication that was the official start. We have an official start of an investigation at the end of July. But we have these things going on earlier, maybe as early as May and June. So we don't know. And why are they fighting so hard to keep Congress from seeing that? If the FBI did everything correctly, why shouldn't they let the committee see it? And why did they hide it from them for so long? I mean, the Gang of Eight, Mr. Comey mentioned that he did not tell them about what was going on. The reason we have a Gang of Eight is so that the FBI can tell Congress what's going on in a controlled way.
The Gang of Eight being the most senior congressional.
Right.
Congressional.
And that's why we have a Gang of Eight, to deal precisely with very sensitive things.
Dan, what do you make of the fact that they still haven't turned over these documents to the Intelligence Committee? I mean, if Trey Gowdy's right, why not turn them over?
Well, I think, Paul, you end up defaulting to something approaching one's worst suspicions about the behavior of the FBI and the Justice Department, because consider we are talking about events that took place in 2016, possibly early 2016. Here we are in the middle of 2018, and the Justice Department and the FBI are essentially saying, trust us over this truly mysterious investigation that began possibly with the legitimate concern over Russians trying to penetrate an American election. But Russians have tried to do that in Germany and France as well. Why has it been necessary for those institutions to keep this investigation to themselves at this late stage, other than the fact that they are perhaps indeed investigating the Trump campaign and possibly the president himself?
Here's an idea, Bill. Why doesn't the president ask his Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, to look into the counterintelligence side of this? No, leave aside the criminal stuff.
Right.
But this started as a counterintelligence probe. The president, I think, has a right to know what his intelligence services are doing. Why doesn't he just say, Dan Coats, you go do an investigation of this and tell me what really happened?
Exactly. Look, there's a lot of things the president could do. The assumption behind your question, I think, is the right one. The most important thing now is for the American people to know what the heck happened in 2016 and what role our intelligence agencies played in it. And there's lots of things the president can do like that, and to declassify a lot of information. What we need is less of people being indicted or so forth than to get the story out of what really happened.
Kim, just to, close out this segment. You had a column this week about Alexander Downer, who was the Australian diplomat who, according to leaked stories, started it off. Why is this important?
Well, it's important because what we've now discovered and put out there is that Alexander Downer, when he met with Papadopoulos, we'd never known how that information was transmitted back to the FBI. It now turns out it was run through the U.S. Embassy in London, and that means the introduction here, or intersection, of the Obama State Department. And that's a political element in this story that is new, at least in regard to that event. And it brings up the question of whether or not was this really entirely driven by intelligence agencies talking to each other, or was there political pressure exerted for the FBI to act?
Yeah, more questions still to come on this. This is a long way from being over. When we come back, the Republican record. President Trump and members of Congress looking to run on their accomplishments in the midterm. So what have they done in the last year and a half, and will it count for anything in November?
To keep this momentum going, to continue this incredible progress, to keep on winning, you have to vote Republican in November. We've gotten now, through confirmation, a record number of judges who will interpret the Constitution as written. We've passed the largest tax cuts and reform in American history. Plus, in the tax cuts, what did we get? The individual mandate is out the window.
President Trump ticking off just some of the Republican accomplishments this week at a rally in Nashville, Tennessee. Polls show the GOP closing the gap when it comes to which party voters will support in the midterm elections, with the latest Real Clear Politics average showing the Democratic lead shrinking to a little over 3%, down from double digits earlier this year. So will the Republican record over the last 18 months be enough to keep control of the House and Senate this November? We're back with Dan Henninger and Wall Street Journal assistant editorial page editor James Freeman and editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Kate, you heard Trump give a couple of examples. Give us a list of what you would call the main accomplishments of this Congress.
Well, the first one is tax reform, Paul. I mean, that was the first in several decades to overhaul the tax code. But there are also a lot of things that haven't gotten as much attention, like a large increase for defense spending that isn't a Reagan-style buildup, but still is an important reversal from the Obama years. And also, just recently, the Congress finished reforms for the Veterans Affairs Agency and a right-to-try bill on experimental therapies. There are a long list of accomplishments.
Yeah, and there's also the individual mandate, I guess, and in that tax reform, they also included the Alaska drilling, opening that up over a couple of decades. And how many appellate judges now have been approved? I think it's more than 20, isn't it? This is not just the Supreme Court, but this is the appellate bench.
Right. No, this is also a new record in the Senate, even as Democrats are invoking a cloture vote or long debate periods on every nominee.
All right, James, let's look on the debit side. What have they failed to do that they promised?
They have failed to control spending, and not just failed to control it, but really make the problem much worse. Essentially, over 2018 and 2019, we're going to spend almost $300 billion more than under previous legislation.
But wait a minute. Part of that was the price of more military spending, was it not? And you're not willing to grant that that had to be done?
Well, I think when you have...
Forget the votes in the Senate, I mean.
I think you have a problem in terms of debt at 75% of GDP, having doubled in the last decade. On our way in the next decade to 100% of GDP, you're getting pretty close to Italy territory in that amount of debt. This is not a place where we want to be, and typically that much debt, I think, is not associated with superpower status.
James,
military.
Italy has 132% debt to GDP. We have 79 or so.
I know.
Okay?
What I'm saying
That's a huge difference.
10 years from now, though, we're going to be at 100 unless we change the trajectory. Now, I would say in his defense, President Trump did not promise us huge cuts in spending. The entitlement reform was not part of his pitch.
Right.
So I'm not sure how much you can hold him to that in terms of what he promised in 2016. But as a governing failure that he and the Congress owns, I think controlling spending would be one of them.
Well, Dan, actually, I'd be willing to give the Congress a break on that short-term domestic spending that James talks about. But I can't give them a break on Medicaid reform, which failed as part of health care reform. I think that was the big failure. Repealing as part of their failure to repeal and replace Obamacare, because that's going to stick with them for a long time as Medicaid increases.
Yeah, it will. And the other thing that they failed to make any progress on is immigration, the DACA bill, bogged down in partisan battling inside the Congress. And I think, James makes a fair point. Spending, the level of spending is a serious issue with a lot of Republican voters. And what we're talking about here is whether you can connect this record to the November elections. Be that as it may, much of what they have done, we forgot to mention the Congressional Review Act, reversing 18 Obama-era regulations. And I think one of the big issues here is the economy under 2 terms of Barack Obama and the economy that we now have after a year and a half of President Trump. And it is like opposite sides of the moon. It was a torpid, meandering economy then. And the economy now is basically through the roof.
Now we're on the sunnier side of the moon. And, this is something where the president has really exceeded his promise on regulation. He promised he was going to knock out 2 rules for every new one, and he's on a pace of about 5 to 1. So he's reducing the overall cost of regulation.
I think the Congressional Review Act, Kate, has been used only 19 times in history, and 18 of them have been in this Congress. What else can we expect to see between now and say when the campaign begins in earnest in September, October?
Well, I think we pointed to one of the Republicans' biggest vulnerabilities this fall, and that's their failure on health care. Democrats have already decided that they're going to make a huge issue out of health care and pin every premium increase on the GOP. And I think they deserve some of the political heat for that failure that all of them campaigned on repealing and replacing that law.
Yeah, but is there any chance that they can make some progress on that, further progress here in the next few months?
I'm not particularly optimistic, but perhaps they can cancel some of their August recess and use that time valuably.
But you don't think that they can get that through the Senate unless they I guess they have to put together a budget to get that 50-vote threshold. Otherwise, they have to get Democrats, and they're not going to get those Democrats.
They won't get those Democrats, and they may not even get Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski again, and they've lost a seat in Alabama. It's just gotten even tougher.
All right, Shames, briefly I'm going to give you credit. You said back when it was double digits, the economy could float this back up and they could get to, they might be able to hold the House and the Senate. You're looking better these days.
Nothing is assured yet, but it's now a game. They've got a good economy. Thanks.
All right, when we come back with the North Korean nuclear summit back on track, we'll ask General Jack Keane what President Trump should demand from Kim Jong-un before going ahead with the meeting or meetings.
We're going to be June 12th. We'll be in Singapore. It'll be a beginning. I don't say, and I've never said it happens in one meeting. You're talking about years of hostility, years of problems, years of really hatred between so many different nations. But I think you're going to have a very positive result in the end.
That was President Trump Friday announcing that the June 12 summit with President Kim Jong-un is back on after meetings this week with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and a top North Korean official. Those meetings capped off by a visit to the White House Friday, where the North Korean delegation delivered a letter from Kim Jong-un to President Trump. Earlier, I spoke with retired four-star General Jack Keane about the expectations for the June 12 meeting. So we have the report of a letter from Kim Jong-un to President Trump, apparently saying, I want to have the meeting, but no demands and no concessions. Is that enough to go ahead with a summit?
Well, first of all, I think the letter is in response to President Trump's letter to Kim Jong-un, and he ended his letter when he was terminating the summit saying, get back to me if you want to go forward. So that's kind of what this is, and we shouldn't expect much more than that. But I think we got to pay real close attention to what Secretary Pompeo is saying. Well, he says on the one hand, we've made great progress. On the other hand, he's also saying there's significant challenges and differences. And I think what they're trying to do, as in his words, set the conditions. In other words, resolve some of these differences so we can set up at least the first summit, because they're likely to be more than that, where there can be some success, where they can at least agree on a framework going forward. The president is really holding all the cards here, Paul. I mean, he doesn't need this summit as much as the North Koreans need it. And this period that we're in right now, although we're getting right up close to the summit, he still has significant leverage. And I'm sure that he's using that leverage to the fullest with his envoys, Pompeo, and also Kim Sung over in North Korea.
But it seems to me that if there's just a meet and greet summit, that is, if there's really no tangible movement on the North Korean side towards denuclearization, then that's a victory for Kim Jong-un, because he'll have sat on the stage with the President of the United States, and it'll have turned out to be kind of a meet and greet. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I totally agree with that. If that's all there is, then the president, at a minimum, should delay the summit and apply more pressure to try to get these differences to close a little bit. And if he can't, he's just got to back away. He cannot go in there and just come out with a framework for a peace treaty ending the war and bring back the families from the North and the South and reunite them and agree in general that the security of North Korea is paramount to the United States. That would be an unsatisfactory solution.
Okay, now there also there's emerging here a difference on the pace of denuclearization, with the United States saying it must be complete, verifiable, and irreversible. And the North Koreans suggesting that, well, we want this to be in a phased form. We want it to, kind of you do one thing and we'll do something. Is that what you see as the biggest gap that has to close?
It certainly is. And they want to do this over a period of many years. Certainly, they want to outlast Trump's first term because they don't know if he's going to have a second one. The president, I think, is right on the mark when he's saying, I want to get this done during my presidency, during my first term, 2+ years is sufficient time to get it done. We can phase it during those 2 years. I'm not going to pass this problem on to my successor as it's been passed on to me. And I think that's a reasonable goal to have, and we should stick to it.
As we know, we've done this, bought this horse twice before. That is the promise of denuclearization over stages. And both times the North Koreans reneged. They stopped. They kicked out inspectors. So, I mean, it's a bit of a gamble with the United States, with any president, taking their word for it again.
Oh, I totally agree. And the Russians and the Chinese are both advising Kim Jong-un to do the phased operation and push it out over many years for the very reason that the North Koreans have taken advantage of us in the past. It's a promise that is not kept. And that's clearly the path that we would be on if we buy into that.
Can the U.S. president put the status of U.S. forces in South Korea on the table to negotiate in return for some promise of denuclearization?
Yes, I think he can. That would really unnerve the Japanese quite a bit. But that doesn't mean it would have to be an immediate withdrawal or a complete withdrawal. That could be done over time. And it doesn't have to be all at once. It could be a gradual withdrawal of those forces. Listen, if we have a peace treaty and the war has ended and Kim Jong-un is denuclearizing and taking down all of his systems, the reason why those troops are there starts to go away. We'd be able to pull those armies away from each other on the DMZ. I mean, that's sort of a happy solution, and it's unlikely to get something like that, I believe. But nonetheless, it would delegitimize the presence of 28,000 troops. I think the president has in the back of his mind, not initially, but eventually he would put those troops on the table to get a final completion of denuclearization. What
about security guarantees that the North Koreans are talking about for Kim Jong-un? I mean, is that something that we can really promise Kim? I mean, how can we guarantee his continuation in power, particularly if they open up to the world and people see just how destitute the North Korean people are?
Well, it is their number one issue. Economics, prosperity is not their number one issue. This is the issue, and it's the reason why they have nuclear weapons, and it's the reason why they are weaponizing ICBMs, because they want to hold the American people at risk to guarantee the preservation of the regime. We'll never get a deal with them, even on the best of circumstances, unless we're able to convince them that we are providing a guarantor of their indefinite security. Kim is a young man, and he's clearly got that in mind as he looks to decades ahead. He wants that regime to be secure.
All right. Thank you, General. Appreciate your being here.
Yeah, good talking to you, Paul.
Still ahead, the Trump administration pushes ahead with a plan to impose steep steel and aluminum tariffs on some key allies. How Mexico, Canada, and Europe are responding, and what it could mean for the American economy. Next. In a move that is stoking fear of an escalating trade war, the Trump administration announced Thursday that it is moving ahead with a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum imported from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. The president first announced the tariffs in March, but granted exemptions to some major trading partners while the U.S. continued negotiations. Those exemptions expired on Friday. The renewed trade tensions come amid some good news, with the U.S. economy adding 223,000 jobs in May, bringing the unemployment rate down to an 18-year low of 3.8%. We're back with Bill McGurn and James Freeman and Wall Street Journal editorial board member Mary Kissel in London. So, Mary, you're over there. What's the reaction been from our allies, and they are allies, in Europe, Canada, and Mexico to this unilateral trade action?
Well, I think it's what you would expect, Paul. It's complete disbelief that the United States would punish such close and important trading partners. And I think the individual country reactions are what you would expect. The Germans were pragmatic. I think the British were measured, and the French were disdainful. And the EU announced that they would take immediate counteraction. Look, the EU supplies about 17% of steel imports to the United States. A lot of it is high end, going into cars and to Detroit. They say they're going to take counteraction, and you've got to believe that they'll put their money where their mouth is. They're going to file a WTO case also.
So, Mary, one question. Is Canada a national security threat, or do you see the invasion from Mexico coming anytime soon? How can you justify that imports from those countries are really a national security threat?
Yeah, well, the short answer is that you can't, Paul. It's absolutely indefensible. And, you know, the real tragedy of all of this is that President Trump is doing exactly what he said he wouldn't do, which is to reward the swamp. He's rewarding certain interests, which is the U.S. and the steel producing industries, steel and aluminum industries, rather. And everybody who uses that stuff downstream is going to get hurt, not to mention U.S. consumers who are going to pay 10% or 25% more for their goods. And it comes at a terrible time also, I'd add, for our European partners who are dealing with Brexit, the terror threat, Iran, Putin on their doorstep.
And I guess the big question, Bill, is how much economic damage will this hit us with?
Well, I think it could be a lot. And the problem with the trade war is that a lot of innocent casualties. And the reason for that is that supply chains are very complicated. Things come from all over. So when you launch one of these things, you hit people that you don't intend. For example, when President Bush put the steel tariffs in 2002, I think the estimate is that it cost 200,000 jobs, more than actually in the steel industry, which is why they were ended early. Right?
The other risk here, James, is retaliation. I mean, all three of these, all of the EU, Canada, and Mexico all said we're going to retaliate. Japan, I think, is coming because they're also not exempted. And what they're doing is they're targeting precise areas that are going to do some political damage to the Republican Party and their Senate candidates and potentially their House candidates. Paul Ryan's Harley Davidson in his district, for example, Bourbon in Kentucky. You've got Republican in Washington State, citrus fruit. And not citrus, but apples and grapes. So there's some downside political risk here, too.
Yeah, and it's especially frustrating. You mentioned that Great Friday Jobs Report. I think all the evidence is that so far the Trump plan to cut regulation and taxes is working within the United States. So now he's saying, but I think more regulation and more taxes at our borders will somehow benefit the United States. It won't. As you mentioned, a lot more people consume steel than produce it. So you're talking about a lot more jobs in the industries that make things out of steel than in the actual producers. So it's a strange idea to fight with our allies. I think what he ought to be doing is getting together with them to say, how do we fix that Chinese intellectual property theft problem he also seems concerned about.
I think there's a problem a danger, Mary, going forward, and that is what happens with NAFTA. On the cusp of a deal where we've been negotiating a renegotiation, a redoing of the agreement, modernization for some time. But this really is a thumb in the eye of the Canadians and the Mexicans, and they were already kind of approaching a deadline in Mexico with its presidential election. I don't know if that can be salvaged.
Yeah, it may not, Paul. I hate to say that, but it may not be salvageable. You know, the other thing that we should worry about, too, when it comes to Mexico is that Mexico's next leader may not be very pro-American. So you might see additional measures that could hurt U.S. consumers, hurt the U.S. economy from the Mexican side.
But do you see over there in Europe any, I mean, is this kind of tariff decision? They had been asking for exemptions. Is this hardening the responses and likely to say, we're going to retaliate? And Trump might say, look, OK, you hit me, I'm going to hit you back again. He's already threatened 25% tariff on German cars, for example, on British cars. That could escalate this. And the more you escalate, the more economic damage you get.
Well, look, negotiating trade deals or going into trade wars is not like buying a condo in Manhattan or erecting an office building. And these leaders over here, Paul, have their own domestic political constituencies. So take Britain. Their steel industry is in a lot of pain right now. And the idea that Prime Minister Theresa May can do nothing or will do nothing in response to this is just fanciful. They have to respond.
Briefly, Bill.
Yeah, no one behaves responsibly in a trade war because of the political thing. So you kind of assume that the other side's going to respond back. And this is the way a lot of innocent people get hurt. And let's remember the American consumers, the kind of people Donald Trump wants to help, they've benefited enormously from the lower prices that come from trade.
And let's face it, I mean, this economy has been doing very, very well, and this is a real risk to that progress. President Trump causing a stir this week with another controversial pardon and hints of more to come. Is the president trying to send a message, as his critics claim? President Trump issuing another controversial pardon this week, this time for conservative commentator and author Dinesh D'Souza, who pleaded guilty in 2014 to violating campaign finance laws in connection with illegal contributions to a Republican Senate candidate in 2012. The president tweeting that D'Souza was treated very unfairly by our government. Mr. Trump also telling reporters Thursday that he's considering pardons or commutations for Martha Stewart and former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, who is serving a 14-year sentence in federal prison on public corruption charges. We're back with Dan Henninger and Bill McGurn. So, Dan, just as a constitutional legal matter, there's really no limit on the pardon power, is there?
No, there really isn't. It's one of the great powers that a president has. There is a process. There is a pardon attorney, a Justice Department. There are several thousand people who feel they were wrongly accused or convicted trying to go through that process. Donald Trump has jumped over all of that to pardon these individuals. And I don't think we should be too doubtful about this, Paul. Donald Trump feels he is in a war with the Justice Department and Robert Mueller, and he is going to use pardons like this to send them a message. Every one of these individuals, Dinesh D'Souza and the two proposed for Martha Stewart and Rod Blagojevich, are connected to prosecutors who have had Donald Trump in their crosshairs one way or another. Preet Bharara in New York, Comey prosecuted Martha Stewart, and Patrick Fitzgerald, a friend of Comey's, prosecuted Rod Blagojevich.
Okay, Bill, is that a proper use of the pardon power? You can use it legally, that's one thing.
Right.
But is it, I mean, you usually would think we want to use the pardon power of the president to enhance justice,
right,
and undo injustices, not to undermine the rule of law.
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One is it is one of the least fettered powers, and that's a reason. There was a debate by the founders of what they should do, and they rejected ideas of having Congress have a check on it. They gave it to a president for a reason. I don't think it's about guilt or innocence. Strictly as a legal matter, the people. I think a lot of it is the idea that a president would have a discretion to redress something that might be legally right. Someone might be legally guilty of all things, but in some ways it's out of whack. It's a check for that. So I think, I think the president can do it. The one check that there is on the pardon is public opinion.
Sure.
It's the politics, and that's what it was meant to be, which is why presidents usually wait until the end of their term to give out the controversial pardons, right?
Well, I really think that the Scooter Libby pardon, Dan, was a terrific act. I think it was deserved. We've been urging it for a long time. I think it undid a mistake that President Bush had made. But then you get to Joe Arpaio. He had essentially refused to honor a court order. That was a different thing. What about these individual cases? You list them. I think I agree with you that he is sending a message. But are these justifiable cases, do you think, just as on the standard of, does this increase respect for the rule of law?
Well, look, Paul, this is a complicated subject. Dinesh D'Souza was convicted for campaign finance violations, Martha Stewart for securities transactions, insider trading, Rod Blagojevich for political corruption. Now, in every one of those cases, we have editorialized that there are not clear lines on some of these issues. You want to respect the rule of law.
Right.
But as attorney Harvey Silverglade has written, there are thousands of ways you can now break a federal law without being aware of it. You can get into trouble very easily. And the pardon power is one way, one sort of thumb on the scale to try to correct a balance against prosecutorial abuse. And, you'd have to go into the details here, but I think there is a legitimate issue raised of just how the public, the people, including celebrities, find some sort of compensation against what prosecutors can do to them.
Briefly, Bill, you wrote about the Martha Stewart case.
Right.
Do you think that the pardon is justified here?
I think it is justified, and I think, as Dan said, it's a redress. And I think, for example, I thought the Scooter Libby pardon was justified, but it's a message to prosecutors, and sometimes it's not about the crime, but about the punishment that is disproportionate, right?
Okay, thank you very much, gentlemen. When we come back, primary voters get set to head to the polls Tuesday in California, a state that could make or break Democratic hopes of taking back the House. Why the primary system there could leave them out in the cold in some key races come November. As primary voters get set to head to the polls in California Tuesday, Democrats in the Golden State are feeling the heat. All eyes are on 3 battleground districts in Orange County, a one-time conservative bastion that backed Hillary Clinton in 2016, once seen as promising pickup opportunities for Democrats as they seek to take back the House. A crowded primary field, as well as the state's unusual top 2 primary system, could leave Democrats without a general election candidate in these key races. We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and Alicia Finley. So, Alicia, 53 House seats in California. How many are held by Republicans?
14.
Only 14.
Right. They're endangered species out there. 7 of the seats held by Republicans are expected to be competitive this cycle.
Those were picked.
Won by Hillary Clinton in 2016, and some of them Democrats actually have a voter registration advantage. A huge one, David Valadio's district up in the Central Valley.
Are most of those seats that are competitive, where are they? In the Southern California, in the Valley?
They're mainly in the Southern California and the Central Valley, which is very agricultural.
Okay, so how does the so-called jungle primary, where the top 2 vote getters get to go on the ballot in November regardless of party, how does that figure in here?
Well, I guess the worry for Democrats right now is that in some of the seats, like Darrell Issa, who is retiring, it's an open seat, you'll get 2 Republicans who will go to November. So they're trying to put their thumb on certain candidates in order so that outcome doesn't happen. This has happened in the past in California.
And the problem is that so many Democrats are running, since it's an open seat.
And it's very divided. In many cases, they all kind of stand for single payer. They're all very progressive, and there's nothing distinguishing them.
So, and there are fewer Republicans running, so that Republicans could pop up and
take
the
Republicans have, some name recognition. You have Diane Harkey down in Darrell Issa's district, who is a Board of Equalization member and ran against high-speed rail.
And that made a name for herself in that district. Now, if they don't take any seats in California, Democrats, they're going to have a harder time picking up the House, aren't they?
Well, I think that's right. I think they're still counting on Pennsylvania and the redistricting there by the state Supreme Court. But California is really their hope. They need to pick up at least probably 4 there.
Kevin McCarthy is from California. He's the majority leader in the House of Representatives. He is trying an interesting maneuver. He wants to push John Cox, the Republican who's running for governor, to finish second so he can get into the final race in November. And you think, okay, well, that makes sense. On the other hand, you disagree with that.
Well, I think
you wrote a piece for us that you disagree with that.
I think the worry there is that you have 2 Democrats, Gavin Newsom, Antonio Villaraigosa, the former LA mayor. Gavin Newsom has really styled himself as very progressive, wholly owned subsidiary of the public unions. If you get John Cox in the top 2 in November, Gavin Newsom is just sure to win. You're probably going to get a lot more leftward tilt of the party.
So the state goes further left.
More spending, probably higher taxes, where Antonio Villaraigosa may actually, there's a chance you get more pension reforms and, pro-school reforms, more charter schools.
But McCarthy, Kim, figures that if you don't have a Republican on the governor's race, then Republican voters might not turn out in those House races and you lose more House seats.
Yeah, I'd push back on that a little bit. I'm not really sure it's possible for California to go more left, and so I look at these candidates, and it's not clear to me it could get much worse. But I think McCarthy's got a really good point that you get a Republican on statewide ballot for that big top governor's job, and you inspire some more turnout for Republicans, because that is going to be key in many of these districts. Hillary Clinton won in some of them, but very narrowly, as Elisa said. There's a lot of voter registration imbalance in some of them. The Republicans' biggest challenge in California is to get their side out to vote that day.
And Dan, what do you make of this jungle primary idea? Do you like this idea of just the top two? Mike Bloomberg pushed that in New York for a while, didn't go through. The idea is that somehow it's going to make our politics move to the center. It won't have the they won't be as polarized. I don't see a lot of evidence that California is becoming less polarized.
Oh, well, no, but I got to tell you, Paul, I love the jungle primary this year in California because what a spectacle it is in a state, as Kim said, that can't move any further left. Typically, in some of these congressional districts, you've got a couple of Republicans running and, say, 5 Democrats. Why? Because of this tremendous anger at Donald Trump. Democrats, left-wing Democrats, have come out of the woodwork to run for Congress and get to Washington to impeach him. This has driven the Democratic National Committee absolutely crazy because the Democratic voters out there can't distinguish between the 5 candidates, and they're worried that ultimately the Republicans will put their 2 candidates at the top of that ballot.
All right, thank you all. We have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week.